Mr. President.
The Majority Whip.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be initiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, criminals in the world today have an international friend. That friend is called the International Criminal Court. The ICC is headquartered in Europe. It claims unchecked power and power to enforce very loosely defined so-called international law, and they're unaccountable. The ICC is a kangaroo court. The U.S. has never ratified this treaty. Neither has Israel. We're not members with this group. This so-called court seems to me to just do the bidding of the country of Iran. It's never issued arrest warrants for leaders of Iran, never tried to prosecute Assad, the former dictator of Syria. The ICC embraces a legal fiction and a moral fraud. And it is the fraud and the fiction that Israel violates human rights and that sovereignty doesn't matter. They also believe that Israel doesn't have a right to defend themselves. Last year, we saw the ICC issue an unjust and unlawful arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel's former defense minister was also targeted. The charges that the ICC brought were baseless, they were biased, and basically the ICC tends to continue to go after the Jewish state. Have many descriptions of President Netanyahu. They are absurd, they are inaccurate. Let's get to the facts. The facts are there was a brutal attack on October 7th of 2023 by Hamas. It was the deadliest single day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Israel has a fundamental right to defend itself, and America stands with the people of Israel. Israel went to extraordinary lengths to limit civilian casualties. Hamas deliberately hid behind civilians. Hamas uses innocent individuals as human shields. Israel has allowed hundreds of thousands of tons of food and supplies to go in to help the people of Gaza. When the food doesn't meet the actual needs of the civilians there, it's not because they haven't sent enough, it's because Hamas steals it first. Israel isn't a member of the ICC. The court has no jurisdiction over it. Israel's a democracy. Israel's judiciary is robust and it's independent. The ICC is deaf to these important facts. It lives in an anti-Israel echo chamber. Because of this prejudice against Israel, the ICC has also attacked Israel's allies. In 2020, the ICC started to investigate American service members who served in Afghanistan for alleged war crimes. President Trump responded swiftly and strongly. He froze the assets of the ICC officials who were involved in the corrupt investigation. President Trump also imposed restrictions, visa restrictions, on ICC officials and on their families. So then what happens? Well, then Joe Biden gets into the White House, and former President Biden, loves saying former President Biden wrongly and weakly overturned these effective sanctions. President Trump restored the sanctions on his first day back in office last week. So today, the Senate will hold a critical vote on a bipartisan bill to hold the International Criminal Court accountable. Senator Jim Risch of Idaho and Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas have been leaders on this issue here in the Senate. Under the bill we're going to be voting on today, any ICC official, employee, or associate who works to investigate, arrest, detain, or prosecute American citizens or our allies will face immediate sanctions. This bill also blocks U.S. funding from the ICC, every penny. Critically, it ensures American taxpayers are not in any way contributing their hard-earned money to foreign institutions that attack our service members. Passing this bill sends a strong message, an important message, that we in America will not tolerate the ICC's lawfare against Israel. If the ICC attacks America or its allies, the consequences will be swift, will be serious, and will be severe. This is about much more than Israel. The ICC also threatens America's safety, our security, and our sovereignty. Like Israel, America is not a member of the ICC. While Israel is the target today, the ICC could turn around and target America's service members and even our leaders in the future. The House of Representatives has passed legislation to sanction the ICC. They've done it several times. Its bipartisan support continues to grow. It grows stronger in the most recent passage. And a majority of Americans support congressional efforts to sanction the ICC. The most recent vote in the House was 243 in favor and only 140 against. 45 House Democrats voted for it. Well, the Senate could have passed ICC sanctions last Congress, but the Democrat leader chose to drag his feet instead. He blocked it from coming here to the Senate floor. He refused to even allow debate. This Congress, Senate Republicans have made strengthening our alliance with Israel a top priority. Republicans can't sit back and allow a kangaroo court to wage lawfare against American citizens or our allies. The Senate will not bend to the pro-Hamas crowd. We will stand with Israel in the face of anti-Semitism and in the face of evil, period. Will Senate Democrats join us? We will find out today. Now, Mr. President, on another matter. Since January 20th, the United States Senate has confirmed 6 of President Trump's well-qualified nominees. Today, we will confirm the 6th. Former Congressman Sean Duffy is the nominee to be the Secretary of Transportation. Congressman Duffy received unanimous support in the Commerce Committee. As Secretary of Transportation, Congressman Duffy will be responsible for ensuring Americans have reliable infrastructure and safe travel. His job is critical to America's economic success. From the Erie Canal to the Transcontinental Railroad in the 19th century, from the Panama Canal to the interstate highway system in the 20th century, infrastructure transformed our commercial republic into an economic superpower. Today, our highways, our bridges, our ports, and our airways need improvement as travel and commerce hit record highs. We need to build great things in America again. Families and businesses need confidence that they'll get where they need to go. Sean Duffy is dedicated to moving our nation forward. As Secretary of Transportation, he will lead the department with safety and modernization at the forefront. I look forward, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, to confirming Congressman Duffy today and working with him during this next administration. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Democrat whip is recognized.
Mr. President, we can all agree that the border of the United States should be secure. And of course, we must deport any dangerous individuals who are here unlawfully. But the executive orders that President Trump signed this past week don't target criminals. In fact, President Trump terminated a Biden administration policy that required immigration officials to prioritize for arrest and deportation individuals who threaten public safety or national security. Instead, President Trump has authorized Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers, known as ICE officers, to make arrests in schools, churches, and courthouses across the country. The President has reportedly even directed ICE to set quotas for arrest, ramping up from a few hundred a day to more than 1,500 per day. These kinds of arbitrary quotas will ensure that essential workers, family members of U.S. citizens, and so many others who are no threat to this country and are not criminals are caught up in these mass deportations. For example, just this weekend, Trump officials stated that the raids they conducted or targeted toward criminals. Yet in Chicago, a husband and father with no criminal history was reportedly arrested by ICE on his way to work. His family was only made aware that something was wrong when he didn't show up at his shift. In New Jersey, ICE agents detained and questioned a military veteran and U.S. citizens simply because they weren't carrying on their person a passport or a license. These actions, like many of the president's decisions on immigration, have nothing to do with protecting public safety or national security. President Trump has also suspended the refugee admissions program. Why is that important? Well, because when American soldiers go overseas to represent this country and to risk their lives for the country that they've sworn allegiance to, the United States, many times they rely on local citizens in those countries to help them. That's what happened in Afghanistan. Men and women risked their lives to step forward and to help our troops, many times to risk their own lives in the service of their country and doing it for the United States. They included families of Afghans who are now facing persecution for that political decision to help the United States. We have offered to them, after going through extensive background checks, an opportunity to come to the United States. Same thing is true with Uyghurs fleeing Chinese persecution and the Rohingya fleeing Myanmar's military dictatorship. Many of these refugees literally wait for decades to come to the United States lawfully, and all must undergo extreme, rigorous vetting before coming. But the president canceled flights for approximately 10,000 refugees who had been approved to travel to the United States after waiting for long periods of time and going through extensive background checks. This includes nearly 1,600 Afghans who had been cleared for resettlement. Many of them risked their lives for the United States cause, and we were giving them safety and security. Those flights have been canceled by President Trump. Many of them fought alongside U.S. troops. Others are family members of U.S. service members. Flights were even stopped for Afghan children reuniting with their families in the United States. Stopping these flights makes America less safe. It is needlessly cruel to American families waiting to be reunited with loved ones. It also sends a message to allies supporting our troops around the world that we will not protect them if they face retribution for helping the United States. Additionally, President Trump is attempting to deny birthright citizenship to children born in the United States if their parents are not citizens or lawful permanent residents. This is a clear violation of the Constitution. I want to read the first sentence of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. It is explicit. It reads, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States, of the state wherein they reside." One sentence, as clear as can be. This order has been blocked. The order by President Trump has been blocked by a judge who was appointed by President Ronald Reagan. Listen to what he said about the lawsuit challenging birthright citizenship and the 14th Amendment's explicit language. Quote, "I've been on the bench for over 4 decades. I can't remember another case where the question presented was as clear as this one is. This is a blatantly unconstitutional order." I was disappointed to see the White House border czar, Tom Homan, come to Chicago recently with ICE agents arresting immigrants, asking them questions after they'd been requested, even after they'd requested to speak to an attorney. Do you know who accompanied him on this raid? Dr. Phil. Dr. Phil, the TV doctor, is not an MD, but for some reason he was invited to go along with this raid. Now, do you remember the many speeches given by President Trump during the campaign about dedicating himself to ferreting out people who were murderers and rapists and drug dealers and mentally ill, dangerous to the United States? I took him at his word that that's what he would set out to do. But apparently, Dr. Phil is an accomplice in this effort. He obviously has been invited to go along for the ride on a raid involving people who could be dangerous to the United States. If this mass deportation is truly focused on dangerous individuals, murderers, rapists, drug dealers, and mentally ill, Dr. Phil has as much business being on these raids as he does performing surgery. Why is he there? In fact, he could complicate the situation. We are talking about a legal process and the possibility of criminal prosecution following. And to have this television character come along for the ride is dangerous and makes no sense. I am concerned these sweeping executive actions will leave those arrested by ICE, including those with lawful status and U.S. citizenship, with little opportunity to even state their case and show that they belong in this country. Let's be clear, 90% of undocumented immigrants have no criminal convictions, 90%. Immigrants who make up more than 40% of home health care aides and children's assistance daycare, an outsized percentage of these and the agricultural workforce are undocumented. Immigrants are a key part of America's success story. I do not want a single dangerous person to remain in this country or to be allowed to seek permanent residence here, period. But there are many who have been here for periods of time, have paid their taxes, followed the law, and should be part of America's future. Our nation needs immigrants in many important places. Come to my state of Illinois and ask the agricultural organizations. They will tell you flat out that without assistance from migrants and immigrants, they just can't do their work. Whether they're running dairy operations, orchards, or regular agricultural pursuits, they need a helping hand. And many times the only ones who will come to help them are those who come from other countries. They put food on our table, they care for our children, and they help care for our parents and grandparents. Many of these people are dreamers who grew up alongside our kids and have gone on to serve our nation as members of the armed services, doctors, and first responders. They believe in the American dream, and I will continue to fight to protect them for as long as I serve in the United States Senate. There is no room in this country for dangerous people, but there's plenty of room for those who aspire to make this a better nation. We should be fair in making a distinction and realizing the difference is significant. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Mr. President,
Minority Leader,
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
without objection.
Mr. President, last night, incredibly and lawlessly, the Trump administration announced a virtual halt to all forms of federal financial assistance. In an instant, one blink of the eye, in the dark of night, Donald Trump has shut off billions, perhaps trillions of dollars that support small businesses, that support families, that support police officers and firefighters, that support hospitals and rural hospitals in particular, that support our localities, our states and cities, our schools, and so much more. Why? Why did Donald Trump do this? Simple: to fund tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy. This decision is lawless, destructive, cruel. The President must rescind this order at once, and Congress must act if he refuses. Make no mistake, this is Project 2025, Project 2025 by another name. And the danger of having someone like Russell Vought, the chief cook and bottle washer of Project 2025, in charge of OMB is frightening. Frightening to just about every American family in terms of what it could do to them. When Project 2025 came out, it was so ridiculed that Donald Trump had to say, "Oh, I don't know much about it." And now he is putting the author of, or one of the main authors of Project 2025 in the place where he can implement all of these horrible, discredited, unpopular findings. That's where they're headed, folks. That's where they're going. And again, why are they doing it? They can pay for tax cuts for the ultra-rich by making these cuts on average American families. This morning, I think every senator's phone has been ringing off the hook. Certainly mine has, with nonstop calls from hospitals and police departments, volunteer firefighters, food pantries, drug treatment centers, on and on and on. And if someone is going to say they're getting no calls, then they're just out of touch, because it affects almost everything. People are worried. People are scrambling. People are in panic mode, trying to figure out how this order is going to affect them. Hospitals with people on life support, food pantries that feed the hungry, police departments that patrol our streets, every one of them is worried because so many of them get federal aid. If federal funding is shut off, so many groups, institutions are worried, can they pay the rent? Can they pay their staffs? Can they keep their operations running? Virtually any organization, and there are millions, that depend on federal grant money to run its day-to-day operations is now in danger. Nonprofits that help disabled veterans are now in danger, thanks to Donald Trump. Funding that supports our nation's mass transit from one end of the country to the other is now in danger, thanks to Donald Trump. Hospitals, particularly rural hospitals, and community health centers are now in danger, thanks to Donald Trump. Meals on Wheels in danger to Donald Trump. Even smaller programs. I'm very proud of something I passed called the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which protects synagogues and religious institutions from anti-Semitic attacks. We just had one in our neighborhood on Sunday. Are now in danger, thanks to Donald Trump. Senior centers, law enforcement, firefighters, water districts, food pantries, all in danger because of Donald Trump. Again, their master plan to hurt average folks from one end of the country to the other, in red states, in blue states, in suburbs, in cities, in rural areas, to take money out of their hides, all to pay for tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy, is now becoming clear. Now becoming clear. The blast radius of this terrible decision is virtually limitless. It's American families who are going to suffer most. American families should make no mistake. The money being stolen from them will be spent, just not on them. It's going to be spent on tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy and the biggest corporations. President Trump must reverse this course immediately. The Budget Committee should slow down its hearings with Mr. Voigt, till it fully comes out what they all intend to do. The funding President Trump is halting is not optional. Congress has approved these funds and they are law. The President does not, no matter what he thinks, have the authority to ignore the law and ignore Congress. And let me be clear, this is not an isolated act, unfortunately. It comes a week after Trump pardoned violent criminals who sought to overturn our election, days after Trump fired independent watchdogs across the government in a naked attempt to shroud his actions from the American people. I can assure every American that Democrats will pursue all available options, legal and otherwise, to halt this assault. I've talked to the Attorney General of New York State, Tish James, and she and her association, I believe she's the head of the State Attorneys General Association, are going to use all their legal power to stop this illegal act. I implore my Republican colleagues, who know in their hearts and their minds that this is a reckless and unconstitutional action, to speak up, to join us as Americans in defense of the law, but most of all, to protect our communities and to protect the American people from this awful announcement. DeepSeek. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 into orbit in 1957, it ignited a space race between the two world's greatest powers, and America won. Yesterday, we faced a similar inflection point between China and the United States. This time, the project is not like Sputnik, landing on the moon. The prize is something so important: artificial intelligence. The recent news from DeepSeek is being called AI's Sputnik moment for America. DeepSeek unleashed something few could have imagined: an AI chat box that runs more efficiently and was developed at much lower cost than U.S. AI chatbots. Within hours of DeepSeek's announcement, their AI chatbot was the #1 downloaded free app on Apple's App Store. And DeepSeek's announcement makes it all but official. China is catching up with the U.S. on AI. It's a wake-up call that Congress desperately needs. If America falls behind China on AI, we will fall behind everywhere: economically, militarily, scientifically, educationally, everywhere. China's innovation with DeepSeek is jarring, but it's nothing compared to what will happen if China beats the U.S. on the ultimate goal of AGI, artificial general intelligence. We must not allow that to happen. This is precisely why I made AI a top priority in the last Congress, with American innovation as my North Star, and I will continue to do so. What we do now on AI, the actions we take, the ways and amounts we invest, the innovation we spur, will definitely define the next decade of this technology. I hope our bipartisan efforts on AI, which made some progress last year, will continue in an even more robust way this year. I stand ready to work with Republicans, this should be bipartisan, to pass legislation and make the investments necessary for the U.S. to win. On RFK Jr., tomorrow Robert F. Kennedy will testify before the Senate Finance Committee on his nomination to become the next Secretary of Health and Human Services. I cannot recall a nominee more dangerous to the health of Americans than Mr. Kennedy. HHS is an agency that depends on science, evidence, and impartiality to ensure the well-being of over 330 million Americans. They ensure we eat safe food, purchase reliable medications, oversee Medicare benefits, and approve the use of life-saving vaccines. Mr. Kennedy, however, is unprepared. His positions have shifted from month to month, moment to moment. He is neither a doctor nor a scientist nor a public health expert nor a policy expert of any kind. When I met with him, he would not answer many questions directly, saying he would defer to the president, who also is hardly a health expert. And in fact, Mr. Kennedy has made a living not by promoting public health, but by actively fighting it. He's the face of the modern anti-vaccine movement, responsible for spreading fringe and outright false beliefs about vaccines. Now, of course, tomorrow we'll hear a very different Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. He'll pretend as if he's now found religion on vaccines, or that his words have been twisted unfairly, or that he was never intended to say he's anti-vaccines. Nobody should believe this 11th-hour conversion of Mr. Kennedy on vaccines. Instead, he should be held accountable for the misinformation he has spread for decades. He must answer not only for spreading wild vaccine conspiracies, but also for spreading many other outrageous claims over the years. From saying antidepressants cause mass shootings to saying AIDS might not be caused by HIV and claiming COVID spared certain ethnic groups. In fact, Mr. Kennedy should answer for the many conflicts of interest he holds with the anti-vaccine movement. According to his financial disclosures, he has made millions by recommending clients to law firms suing vaccine makers. In fact, this was the primary source of his income this past year. A quote from the Wall Street editorial board, certainly no friend of Democrats, said it best. The risk is high that Mr. Kennedy will use his power and pulpit at HHS to enrich his trial lawyer friends at the expense of public health and medical innovation. That's not some liberal publication. That's the Wall Street Journal editorial board. Donald Trump promised to bring a golden age to America on day one. But if Mr. Kennedy is confirmed, it'll be a golden age for pseudoscience and possibly even self-dealing in our government. Finally, on January 6th, today, Senate Democrats will go to the Senate floor with a resolution that says something very simple. We condemn pardoning individuals guilty of assaulting Capitol Police. I thank my good friend Patty Murray for leading this important resolution. No Republican should block it. It should be a no-brainer to say people who attack police don't deserve pardons. By handing out these pardons to convicted criminals, President Trump is effectively saying, you want to attack our brave police officers? That's okay. How are these pardons supposed to make Americans better off? How does pardoning lawless rioters help people with affording groceries or paying the rent or for medication? Pardoning rioters is not what Americans want the president to be prioritizing, even though it was one of his first acts. They want to see answers to the problems that impact them: inflation, good-paying jobs, a better future. Our Capitol Police, meanwhile, deserve nothing less than our full and steadfast support for everything they do to keep us safe every single day. The very least we can do for them as senators is declare that those convicted of attacking Capitol Police officers do not deserve a presidential pardon. Yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, have you heard your doctor say there's no vaccine that is safe or effective? Or there are much better candidates than HIV for what causes AIDS? Or school shootings started happening with the introduction of Prozac and other drugs. If your physician said any of those things to you, you would look for a new physician. And yet this week, my colleagues on the Senate Finance Committee and Health Committee are going to consider the nomination of someone who's not only said all those things and more, but if confirmed, he would be responsible for the health and well-being of the entire nation. The unique threat that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. poses to our country really cannot be overstated. And now it is up to us, the 100 members of the United States Senate, to deny him the opportunity to use America as one big test lab for bygone diseases. And I want to explain what I mean by that. He thinks that FDA trials are not enough to determine the efficacy of a vaccine, and so he's suggesting that we use placebo in the population. What does that mean? Something might save someone's life, and something might be essentially a sugar pill, but you don't get to know. There are international conventions against this approach. The Tuskegee experiments conducted by the United States Public Health Service were universally rejected. And the Congress banned this approach because you cannot withhold life-saving care from anyone. Now, saying crazy things doesn't seem to be disqualifying for a nominee these days, I understand. But it's not just that he said crazy things or holds deranged views. It's that he has acted on them. It's that he has acted on them. And I want everybody to listen what exactly happened in Samoa. Not 20 years ago, not 10 years ago, but in 2019, while he was chairman of the anti-vaccine group, he flew to Samoa because he sensed an opportunity to exploit people's hesitations about taking the measles vaccine. People were understandably worried after an accident involving improperly prepared vaccines killed 2 babies. It was a tragedy, and it was a costly mistake, but not a reason to abandon the measles vaccine altogether. But RFK sought to make people more afraid. He discouraged people from taking the vaccine because he wanted to, quote, run a natural experiment to see how people fared against the disease without protection. To see how people fared against the disease without protection? This guy is up for HHS, Health and Human Services? This guy just wants to see what would happen if we didn't give people the life-saving protection that they need? He literally flew to the other side of the planet to turn people's fears into a data collection opportunity. For some context here, Samoa is a small country and had a population of around 200,000 people at the time. People knew each other and word got around fast. A Kennedy was in town saying a thing. And so it was no small thing that this man from America, the last name Kennedy, pretending to be a health expert, was there peddling all kinds of lies to prevent people from getting a life-saving vaccine. And those lies spread fast. Vaccination rates plummeted, and within 5 months, Samoa had a measles outbreak. 5,700 people were infected with the measles. 83 people died. Almost all of them were children. That was the conclusion of Mr. Kennedy's natural experiment. Children died. This isn't some ancient history I'm digging up here. This was less than 6 years ago, and it is alarmingly reminiscent of one of the darkest chapters in our country's history with the Tuskegee experiment. For 40 years, beginning in 1932, the United States Public Health Service ran an experiment with 600 black men in Alabama. The majority of them had syphilis, and the objective was to, quote, observe the disease process. And so even when penicillin became the standard of care in 1947, the men who needed that treatment, who could have been given life-saving care, were denied penicillin. Researchers did nothing as men died and they went blind because they wanted to see how the disease would develop. a natural experiment. It took a young doctor, not long out of medical school, who read about the study in a medical journal and couldn't believe his eyes. He could not understand how the United States government had come to view these poor sharecroppers as expendable, as subhuman. He thought about the Hippocratic Oath, and he and every doctor like him had sworn to. What happened to first do no harm? And so, not knowing what else to do, but knowing he was risking a whole lot by speaking out, he wrote to the study's authors. And I want to read a bit of what he wrote. I'm utterly astounded by the fact that physicians allow patients with a potentially fatal disease to remain untreated when effective therapy is available. I assume you feel that the information which is extracted from the observation of this untreated group is worth their sacrifice. If this is the case, then I suggest the United States Public Health Service and those physicians associated with it in this study need to reevaluate their moral judgments in this regard. The man who wrote that letter and was the first and for a long time the only person to sound the alarm about the depravity of the Tuskegee experiment was my dad, Dr. Irv Schatz. It's one of the many reasons that he's my hero. But I never thought that 60 years later, I'd be standing in the very body that passed legislation in response to that shameful period, arguing against confirming someone who wants to replicate that experiment at scale. That's what RFK Jr. wants to do. He wants to use Americans as lab rats in a national experiment. And if it means bringing back the measles or the mumps or rubella or polio, so be it. That is the cost of doing business as he sees it. I understand my Republican colleagues are facing a lot of pressure from within. It's a new administration, and you want to give them deference. An executive, generally speaking, gets to have their team. But this nomination is not actually like the others. Even if you don't want to take Mr. Kennedy's words so literally, maybe you think he's just wondering aloud, look at his actions. Look at what he's done. Time and time again, he's abandoned every physician's first principle. Do no harm. I shall do by my patients as I would be done by, and I shall minimize suffering whenever a cure cannot be obtained. That's part of the oath every medical student takes at graduation before they can practice, and yet the person nominated to lead the country's entire health system has consistently done the exact opposite. He has caused disease, he has caused pain, he has caused death. And so the vote we're going to be taking on this nominee is much more than your party or mine. It's life or death. And I promise you, if this person is confirmed, it will not age well. Not in a Republican primary, not in a Democratic primary, not in your family, not in your community. Nowhere will an RFK I vote age well. This person is going to cause disease across the United States. I urge a no vote.
Clerk, call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
President.
Senator from Texas.
President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Mr. President, as the world knows, it goes without saying that one of President Biden's biggest failures was security at our southern border. In fact, the situation is so dire that now Democrats, after the November 5th election, are actually finally seeing the light, that they need to do something to recapture the support of the American people. And that was reflected in the first piece of legislation we passed that President Trump will sign into law tomorrow, the Laken-Riley Act. 12 of our Democratic colleagues in the Senate, 46 in the House, supported that bill, which I have to think before the November 5th election they would have uniformly voted against. But they realized that they were so out of sync with the American people and our national security interests. I'd love to say they got religion or saw the light. Maybe they just counted the votes. I'm heartened, though, that they have seemed to buck the liberal status quo when it comes to the border and actually helped us pass a law that will strengthen our security and make our communities safer. But let's make no mistake about where this crisis came from that took the life of Laken-Riley and so many others. This is one that the Biden administration invited and exacerbated from day one after President Biden took office. On the campaign trail in 2020, President Biden made this pledge, and I'll quote. He said, "I would in fact make sure that we immediately surge to the border all those people who are seeking asylum," close quote. Now that was a big welcome mat or invitation for anybody and everybody across the planet to show up at the border and to claim asylum. And because of the backlog in asylum claims and the fact that they would be released into the interior of the country, basically that was a free ticket into the United States outside of what should be our regular, orderly, lawful immigration system. But President Biden didn't stop there. When he assumed office, he ended all the policies of the previous administration, very successful policies like President Trump's Remain in Mexico policy. He halted the construction of the border wall and instead spent federal dollars to store unused wall materials. And then toward the end of, right before the election or right after the election, we found out they were actually selling these border wall materials for essentially salvage, for pennies on the dollar. And knowing that with President Trump resuming office again, we would have to repurchase those items, it just seemed like a kick in the teeth for the American taxpayer and contemptuous, frankly, of law and order. So we also know that, sort of to add insult to injury, that the Biden administration created the so-called CBP One app. This is an app for your phone. CBP stands for Customs and Border Protection. So basically what happens is people outside of the country who wanted to come here and claim asylum, knowing they would be released into the interior of the country and have to wait for years, maybe as long as a decade before they would appear in front of an immigration judge, they could literally make an appointment to show up at a port of entry using the CBP One app. So here you have the federal government, the U.S. government, facilitating the movement of people into the country that were transported here by criminal organizations that got rich thanks to the Biden administration. And it was not uncommon to see people coming from far-flung parts of the planet. Now, I live in Texas. We have a 1,200-mile border with Mexico. We're accustomed over the years to people from Mexico or Central or even South America coming to the border.
but not people from Latvia, from China, from the Middle East. But under the Biden administration, they knew that they were going to be able to come to the United States, and they could actually even schedule an appointment, thanks to the misguided policies of the Biden administration. Even as this crisis continued to grow, President Biden ended the use of the very effective Title 42 authority, which was used during COVID to limit the movement of adult males into the country because of the COVID situation. While this is a national crisis that President Biden created, it is one that has been felt most acutely by the people of Texas, the 31 million people I represent. In the midst of the Biden administration's abject failure to keep the American people safe and to control the movement of people and drugs, including some of the most dangerous criminals you can imagine, it was up to the state of Texas and our leadership, like Governor Abbott, to step up and defend our people and our borders to the best we could. Now, understand, border security is not normally a state function because this is an international border, which means it is a federal responsibility. But what are we supposed to do when the President of the United States and the federal government fail to do their job? Well, the state stepped up, which means not only our leadership, our National Guard, but also Texas taxpayers. In other words, we had to pay the tab to provide for border security such as we could, instead of the federal government picking up the tab as it should have. So Governor Abbott initiated Operation Lone Star, which resulted in more than 500,000 illegal immigrants being apprehended by Texas law enforcement. More than 50,000 criminals were arrested, and more than 240 miles of border barriers were built by the state, not at federal expense, a federal responsibility, but at state expense by state taxpayers. This law enforcement operation also intercepted 500 million doses of fentanyl. Fentanyl, as we now know, is spread throughout the United States, is hidden in counterfeit pills that look like an innocuous pharmaceutical, only to find out that it will kill you at small doses. It took roughly 70,000 lives last year alone, and it's a leading cause of death for young people between the age of 18 and 45. That's what comes over the border, in addition to the millions of people. I applaud the efforts of the governor and our state legislature to step up and secure the border and to protect my fellow Texans, even when the federal government, the President of the United States and Vice President turned a blind eye. As a result of Operation Lone Star, Texas was able to reduce illegal immigration into the state by 87%. But as I said, these efforts came at a very real cost. The state of Texas spent nearly $4.8 billion on walls and barriers, local grants to counties and cities, processing criminal arrests, and moving migrants out of small Texas towns. Deploying the National Guard for building border barriers, guarding and constructing those barriers, and apprehending migrants who were illegally present in the United States cost another $3.6 billion. Then Texas had personnel costs for our state troopers, Department of Public Safety troopers, who were responsible for repelling additional illegal migrants, arresting those who otherwise broke the law, transnational gang members, cartel members, human smugglers, and human traffickers. The federal government didn't do it. So Texas did. That came to an additional $2.25 billion in taxpayer expenditure, money that should have been provided by the federal government for a federal responsibility borne by the taxpayers in my state. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice spent an additional $311.2 million on anti-gang violence. The number of dangerous gangs emanating from Central America or Venezuela are well known. And indeed, these are some of the most dangerous people that have made their way into the United States as a result of the policies of the Biden administration. So Texas had no choice but to deal with anti-gang violence. And then there's the costs associated with the prosecution of these border crimes at Operation Lone Star's criminal processing centers. And then the game wardens. This was an all hands on deck. Even the game wardens in Texas played a role. They patrolled the Rio Grande River to prevent illegal entries. Criminal processing centers required health and safety services, and the list goes on and on and on. This was an all-of-government effort in the state of Texas. Even the Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission put millions of dollars toward interdicting human trafficking at the border. All told, as a result of the Biden-Harris administration's abject dereliction of its responsibility at an international border to enforce the law cost the state of Texas about $11.1 billion. Now, Texas, unlike many states in the rest of the country, doesn't have an income tax. We fund our government through sales tax and through property tax, and we don't have an income tax. This was a painful expenditure by the Texas legislature and by our leadership. And that figure doesn't even take into account what local counties and cities and other nonprofits were forced to further shoulder when it came to the financial burden. Before President Biden came to office, Texas spent $800 million every 2 years on border security, roughly $400 million a year. That means that taxpayers are on the hook for nearly 14 times what they typically spent on border security due to the failure of the Biden administration. It wasn't just negligence, it was intentional. It was willful. Keeping our nation's borders secure is the responsibility of the federal government. It is not, and it should not be, the responsibility of the individual states. That's part of our constitutional framework. This is a crisis that the Biden administration literally invited by rolling out the welcome mat and refusing to enforce laws that were on the books. What's worse, in the midst of this disaster, the federal government reimbursed others, nonprofits, non-governmental associations, to help facilitate illegal immigration through FEMA's emergency food and shelter program to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. So Texas has been stuck with the check for the Biden-Harris failed policies, and that's wrong. Governor Abbott has asked Congress to reimburse Texas for its costs that should have been incurred by the federal government in the first instance. I support this request, and along with our state delegation, we are going to fight to get Texas taxpayers the money they're rightfully owed. The Texas congressional delegation is 40 individuals strong, 38 in the House and 2 here in the Senate. And we believe it's only right and just for the federal government and the Congress to reimburse the state for expenditures it should have never had to make. If the Biden-Harris administration had simply done its job which is to provide for a secure border. Surely, if the federal government can reimburse non-governmental organizations for rolling out the welcome mat for illegal migrants, it could also cover Texas's expenses for keeping U.S. citizens safe. And the work that was done along the border just did not accrue to the benefit solely of people in Texas. I mentioned the fentanyl crisis. Fentanyl now, unfortunately, has spread to 50 states. But the work that was done at the border, keeping some of the fentanyl out of the country and arresting criminals at the border, that benefited people in all 50 states. Again, another reason why this is a federal responsibility. It's only a matter of basic fairness that the federal government should step up and help address a crisis that it was a problem of its own making. Texas taxpayers should not have to foot the bill alone as a result of President Biden's mishandling of border policy. So I urge all of our colleagues here in the Senate, as well as our colleagues in the House, to work with me and the Texas delegation, all 40 of us, on fulfilling this request by Governor Abbott to reimburse Texas for its expenses that it never should have had to spend and make if President Biden and the federal government had simply done its job. The federal government created this crisis, and it's up to the federal government to pay the tab. Mr. President, I yield the floor. I would note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
From Idaho.
Are we in our quorum call?
We are.
I'd ask quorum call be vitiated, please.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I come to the floor today to talk about the ICC bill and the vote we're going to have immediately following lunch hour. When the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister for defending their country against an unprovoked, brutal attack on their homeland, the ICC was exceeding its mandate. There's no question about that in my mind, and further, there is no question in my mind that it is a clear demonstration of the court's inability to focus on justice and determine what is justice and determine what is right and what is wrong. The ICC does not have jurisdiction over Israel. This clearly political move erased the last illusions of legitimacy for the organization and is just another example of partisanship and anti-Semitism infecting our international organizations like the United Nations, the ICJ, and of course, the ICC. This needs to end. The United States needs to stand in solidarity with our ally Israel, not only by providing them with the assistance they need for their self-defense, but by sanctioning the ICC to compel the organization to change its corrupt behavior and countering this blatant anti-Semitism wherever it appears. I look forward to working with the Trump administration and Secretary of State Rubio, who I believe will be excellent partners in rooting out the corruption in our international organizations, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this bill to support our greatest ally in the Middle East, Israel. This is a unique opportunity to vote, and vote on this will very clearly state whether you stand on the side of Israel, whether you stand on the side of the United States, where we will not cede jurisdiction over our citizens to such a corrupt and blatantly inequitable institution as the ICC. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Note the absence of quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Without objection. The question occurs on the Duffy nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis.
Aye.
Thank you. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Barrasso, Curtis, Graham, Lee, Risch, and Schmidt. Senators voting in the negative: Cortez Masto and Smith. Mr. Husted. Aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mrs. Moody, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. She has gray. Ms. Lemus, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Justice, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Fetterman, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Lujan, no. Ms. Rosen, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Gallego, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Ms. Slotkin, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Also Brooks, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Padilla, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Paul, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 77, the nays are 22. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action. Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2 p.m. Thank you.